to the Nebraska State Board of Education work session. The August State Board work session will now come to order. Denise, will you please call the roll?
Lisa Fricke.
Present.
Patsy Ko-Johns.
Present.
Rachel Wise.
Present.
John Witzel.
Here.
Molly O'Halloran.
Present.
Patricia Tim.
Yes.
Maureen Nichols.
Yes.
Patrick McPherson.
Here.
Commissioner Bloomstead.
Present.
All present.
Thank you, Denise. Information regarding the Open Meetings Act is posted on the east wall of this room on the south side of the door. Live web streaming will be available through the State Board of Education website. Also a reminder, remind board members to engage their microphones before speaking and to turn them off when they are done speaking. And please turn off your cell phones at this time. Thank you very much. Commissioners' report and agenda overview.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to hit the consent agenda. I believe we're going to turn it over to the Strategic Planning Committee so Dr. Kennedy can do the Schuyler presentation. But I'll first do the reminder on consent agenda process. If you have any items that you had questions about or would like to pull off of the consent agenda, just fill out that pink form and give it to Scott, and then we'll get those things addressed for you as well. So with that, I guess I turn it back to the president to move on with the slight change in agenda plan there.
Thank you, Commissioner. Patricia Tim, if you would brief us on the Strategic Planning and Improvement, Performance and Improvement Committee.
We had an outstanding presentation by members of the Schuyler community. There are a couple of their administrators and their board president this morning, and we are going to have Dr. Kennedy come up. We're sorry to say that folks from Schuyler had meetings scheduled this afternoon. Since we are getting close to school starting, they had things to do, so they had to go back, but Dr. Kennedy is going to give us a short presentation, and then I think the committee has a couple of comments before we go ahead. So, Dr. Kennedy? And she's bringing reinforcements.
The answers of the questions.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Lane Carr, and I'm the Director of Accountability and AQUES here at the department, and I'm very excited to have Dr. Kennedy here as well as the rest of our team. With me up here is Russ Masco, who serves as a liaison for our priority schools, as well as a newer member of our team at the department, Shirley Vargas, who is our Student Achievement Coordinator. And then, of course, Dr. Cathy Kennedy, who is our consultant from KOK Consulting. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Kennedy to tell us a little bit about the Schuyler Central Progress Plan for the upcoming year.
Okay, thank you, Lane. Good afternoon, board members. Thank you for having us to have another conversation regarding the Schuyler Schuyler Central High School Priority Schools Plan. And you have that in your documents that you've reviewed. I know you've looked at them since we did the presentation in June. Just want to kind of remind you of some of the components of the plan and some of the processes that we've gone through to create the plan. So we actually first started with Schuyler on April 26th when the commissioner and deputy commissioner and a couple of us from the department, as well as myself, visited the school and had the initial meeting with the school board there in Schuyler. Very pleasant meeting, lots of great questions from the Schuyler School Board regarding the priority schools designation. And I'll tell you that one of the things that really struck me was when Dr. Bloomstead talked to the school board about being named a priority school means that it's his priority and your priority as a board to provide support to them. And I think that really kind of lowered a little bit of level of concern regarding that priority status, that it's the priority that we're going to focus on ensuring that students and staff members are successful at the school and be a partner in that process. So that was a really good initial meeting. It lasted a couple of hours. The next morning we visited with that same group of people, visited with the leadership team, and then visited a couple of the classrooms. We weren't able to visit all the classrooms, but did go through quite a few of the classrooms just to let them know that we were there to provide support. I went back along with Lane, Russ was there, several members of the NDE staff, and then also members of the ESU staff, ESU 7 staff, came on May 2nd for the diagnostic review process. In the diagnostic review, we interviewed students. They talked to us about what they were so proud of at their school, and then opportunities of things that they thought could be better at their school. We also interviewed community members, district leaders within the businesses. We also interviewed parents, and then we met with staff at the end of the day. During that time, the diagnostic review, we also did a school visit of every classroom that we could possibly go in. And then we came out in the hallway as an administrative team with the principal, the assistant principal they had their soccer tournaments during that time as well, so he had to go take care of that. But it was the principal and the curriculum leader. We came out in the hallway and we talked about what instructional strategies we saw happening in the classroom, and they identified some things that they're doing really well instructionally, and then some needs that they had as well during that diagnostic review process. We did a very quick turnaround on May 9th when I went back along with some NDE staff. There were ESU staff members there as well to provide the executive review report to the leadership team. So the superintendent and the principal at Schuyler felt that it was real important for their leadership team to hear the report, the diagnostic review report, so they brought them into the meeting room. At the very end of the day, we shared the report with them, lots of head nods in the room, so we knew we captured the opportunities as well as the things that they were most proud of. On May 22nd, we scheduled time where there were about 30 of us that collaborated with the school. Representation again from the specialist at NDE, the people that you see sitting here, as well as ESU staff members, and then teachers from Schuyler Central High School, as well as their board member came by to help us draft the priority schools plan that you have in front of you. We presented that draft to you on June 7th. On July 18th, my consultant and I that's going to be serving the school as well, Dr. Molly Capps, visited the school administration to do a planning session with them. And we kind of mapped out what we were going to focus on if we received approval through this process, and we'll be ready to hit the ground running in August whenever we begin the service to them. And then we're here today to seek your support of the priority school plan. As you know, there are, the priority school plan is based on 3 effective schools levers as well as the AQuest tenets, and I just wanted to bring those to your attention as well. We have one goal that is focused on clear, compelling direction, one goal that's focused on student and staff culture, and then 3 goals around instructional leadership and building the capacity of instructional leadership in the classroom as well as with the administrative team. And then you see the AQuest tenets that we've identified under each of those goals that certainly dovetails beautifully with our focus and ensuring that there's alignment to your state accountability process. If we look at clear, compelling direction, the goal around that is really to ensure that there's a shared commitment about the purpose of Schuyler Central High School. So we'll be doing some work with ensuring the communication process of the vision, the mission, the core values, the core beliefs, and then the attainable goals. So these goals, even though they recently went through, 2 years ago I believe, went through a strategic planning process with community members, business leaders. They brought all those people together to create their strategic plan. We've used that plan to ensure that these goals are attainable for them and they're not too overwhelming. So that's what the Priority School Progress Plan is. But we want to make sure that we're communicating those goals to the community just as much as we're communicating it to the internal stakeholders. Another one of the strategies under clear, compelling direction is two-way communication. So ensuring that language barriers are not a problem whenever we're communicating with families within the school and families are communicating with us. within the school and among the other stakeholders of the community as well. So we want to ensure that that two-way communication process is there, that we're seeking advice as well as providing support. The comprehensive review of programs to ensure the highest return on investment of the programs that they're currently using. The ESU 7 is going to take on the process of doing that comprehensive review, which we're really excited about. They've done that in the past in some of their schools, so that partnership is going to help the school determine what are those programs that they're using within the school that are not giving them the return on investment aligned to the Nebraska standards. Another part of strategy is family engagement. That's always, in any school, something that we strive to improve is the family engagement. Not just parent engagement, but the entire family. How do we ensure that they're just as proud of their school as they are whenever they were in elementary school from a high school perspective? So we want to make sure that we're, again, that two-way communication will help with that. It was also real important to the school board, and Rich, the school board chair this morning, was very vocal on that as well, that it's important that they receive monthly updates on their progress plan at their school board meetings. So there's a set agenda item already on their school board agenda that the superintendent and the principal will provide updates regarding these three levers and how they're doing with the AQUEST tenets, as well as these goals and strategies each month that they have their school board meetings. And it was also apparent this morning that those school board meetings are, the agenda is available for the public. They're real transparent about any materials that they put up on their website, so all of us can go on and look to see what they actually reported on as well. Dan wanted us to know that. The student and staff culture, also the lever there, the goal around that is real important to the teachers within the building, that they increase expectations for learning for all students within the building. So you'll see that the focus here is developing the instructional leadership capacity of the leadership team. The principal, the assistant principal, and Dan, the superintendent, has been very willing to allow the elementary and middle school principals as well to be involved in this process. So we just ordered Leverage Leadership, which is our book study, and he wanted those ordered for all of his administrators. So we'll do a book study with everybody in the district that I think will create that coherence that will help improve the entire school district. And then we'll do coaching around that as well as the year progresses. We want the principal and the assistant principal to feel really good about these evidence-based instructional practices that they're coaching and have a deep understanding of those before we involve others. But we're thinking around October, November that we'll start involving the other principals in the coaching process as well. The principal, when we did the diagnostic review, and increasing student engagement was extremely important to him. And when we think about engagement, we don't just think about students turning and talking to each other. We think about choices that they get to make, whether it is classes that they take or choices within the school, within the classroom, within these classes on how they share their knowledge of mastery of the concepts. So relevance is another part of that process. How is the content relevant to the student? So we want to increase that engagement and help teachers to see that when we present it in a relevant way, that it makes sense to students and it has something to do with the world that they live in, they're much more engaged in the content and want to master the content. So we'll work on some strategies around that, which is the next strategy, which is creating that common instructional language. Schuyler Central High School already has a wonderful foundation of working with Marzano Lab, the Marzano Lab with evidence-based instructional strategies. What we have to do is just really ensure that those strategies are utilized throughout the entire school, and that the principal and assistant principal are able to coach teachers and recognize those particular strategies, which is the next process to provide that effective feedback to teachers. So when teachers are doing something well, we need to recognize that. We need to let them know that, you know what, here's the strategy that we saw you using today. Keep using it because it makes a huge difference. Here's what we saw with learning as a result of being in your classroom for 15 to 20 minutes. We'll provide that feedback to the teachers every time that we visit their classrooms. And the superintendent's goal is that the principal and assistant principal are visiting classrooms every single day. That's what he hopes that happens. He's actually hired someone to help with the whole concept of student management. Those were his words, which I thought were really cool. I call it discipline from the South, but it's student management, managing their student behavior. And so he's hired somebody to deal with that side of the house so that the principal and assistant principal can really focus on developing their instructional leadership capacity. The teachers, when we did the diagnostic review, one of the strategies we wrote in the plan, it was important to them to have school-wide PLC norms for how they interact with each other in their PLCs. They have PLCs every Friday for the last couple of hours of school. So the students are released, they do a little bit of intervention for students that need that intervention support, and then they have time for professional development for their teachers on Fridays. So they want norms to help with what the expectations are with the meeting, as well as what are the expectations with implementation. Which, when you have that coming from teachers, you know you're in a really good place. And then, of course, in this particular goal, the board also wants monthly updates on how we're doing with implementing those particular strategies. In instructional leadership, there are 3 goal areas. The first one is college, career, and civic readiness. When we think about that, the first thing that we're going to do, that we did some planning around this summer, is identify the attributes that define the future-ready graduate for Schuyler Central High School. What does the community need for their graduates to be prepared to do, to know? What skill sets should they have? Oftentimes those are not just knowledge skill sets, but it's also things like soft skills, like responsibility, those executive functioning skills. We want them to show up to work on time. So how do we develop those attributes of that future-ready graduate? There's also, they're going through the, let me get my name. Revision process. They're going through the revision process with CTE this year. They've already submitted their application. Their application has been accepted by the CTE department here at NDE, and they've already had some communication back and forth. So they're going through that process of evaluating their CTE program so that they can determine what are those opportunities that are aligned to the needs of their community, and as well as their student needs. There's also a focus time that they have, which is relationship development within their school. And one of the things that we're going to look at is how can we revision that focus time where we're developing relationships, but we're also, as Shirley talked about in our committee today, ensuring the safety of the students. So not just the physical safety, but the academic, the social, and the emotional safety as well. So we're really looking at that focus time being a time where students feel comfortable asking for help, but they also feel comfortable with the peer relationships as well as the relationships with the adults who are advocating for them on a daily basis. And then for this particular goal, we'll also do the monthly updates to the board, school board. Our second area our second goal under instructional leadership has to do with our English learners. So we want to create a process where we have a systematic, coherent program, if you will, but it will be based on evidence-based strategies of language acquisition, as well as strategies that teachers can use that are common throughout the school, so students don't have to wonder how my teacher is going to introduce, for example, the vocabulary. We're going to create some common ways that we can do that, and expectations that I'm not just going to deliver content to English learners, I'm going to ensure that they understand the language that they're being expected to master as well. So Shirley's going to work with us on that whole process, right?
Terry Schuster.
Pardon me?
With Terry Schuster.
And Terry, that's right. Shirley and Terry are going to help us with that process of helping them to understand and utilize those strategies. Again, they've been working with the Marzano Lab, so they've had professional development with a lot of these particular strategies. What the school and the teachers indicated is there's just not a lot of implementation. So we have to ensure that there's coaching going on by the leadership team to ensure that the teachers are implementing. It's not because they don't want to sometimes. I think it's just because there's so many things that teachers are expected to do that we just have to make sure that we help prioritize that. So the coaching is going to be important, and you'll see that there's a connection between the English learners as well as the high expectations. Coaching is in both of those places purposefully, so that we're making sure that our focus is to help support the English learners within the school. It was also important to the superintendent that we look at the onboarding process for newcomers within the school and create a systematic process for academic plans as well as how they are introduced to the school. So having advocates within the school to help them to be successful on a daily basis, day one, not wait until day 17. But day one, there's an onboarding process that we create, and we use that as our systematic approach. And again, monthly updates to the school board. Our third area is a huge area that requires a lot of support from partners. And the partners will be the specialist from NDE as well as the curriculum specialist from the ESU 7. We're going to focus this year just on ELA and mathematics. So that was a decision that the staff as well as the leadership team decided we couldn't really unpack all of the standards this year and do a really good job with it. So we're just going to focus on math and ELA. You'll see that that's one of the strategies as well, is to look at the Nebraska standards and make sure that each of the teachers that are teaching these content areas for math and ELA understand what the standards are asking them to ensure that students are mastering. Most of the time, what I find when I work with high school teachers is they know their content very well. They know the content side of the standards. It's the thinking level that we have to make sure that they understand and that they get students to that high expectation of that level of thinking where they're doing problem solving, for example, in math versus just computation. So we want them to make sure that we're stepping up and raising those expectations with rigorous delivery of instruction. At the same time, we need to ensure that teachers are understanding the cognition level that we want students to be focused on. Another strategy within this section is the focused and unpacked learning goals in every classroom. Schuyler already, in I would say 80% of their classrooms, have learning goals posted on the board for students, so they know what the expectation is for the lesson that the teacher is teaching that particular day. What we are missing there is truly the unpacking of that for the English learners, so that's another one of our strategies that we'll use. But we'll also want to ensure that the teachers are referencing that goal throughout their lesson to remind students of what they need to focus on, because you well know that all of us do that. We have a tendency to think about other things during a lesson. Students do the same thing. So we want to get them focused back on that, so we want to make sure that we're referencing that numerous times during the lesson. And then we eventually want students to own that particular learning goal. So we're going to unpack, we're going to reference, we're going to ensure that students own those as well as ensuring that they're aligned to the state standards. Curriculum maps is something that we are going to start working on this year. We won't quite finish it in all of those components that you see up there. They are already doing a lot with proficiency scales, so we'll utilize those proficiency scales with the assessments that they're creating, and then starting to build those curriculum maps throughout the school year with the help of and support of your team here in the ESU. We also, again, are asking the ESU, and they have graciously agreed to come in and do an audit of instructional materials. Corey Epler here, Dr. Epler has actually started that process for the State Department, and we want to certainly build on that and utilize the framework that he's created to do that at Schuyler Central High School, because they have a lot of stuff and a lot of materials and a lot of programs. And we really have to focus those so that teachers know in what tier of instruction do we need to utilize those particular programs and not be expected to use just pieces of each one of them. And let's see which ones are truly aligned to your state standards as well. The common lesson plan format, the leadership team has requested that we look at that in the spring when we were doing our planning, because we really want teachers to understand the standards and understand the delivery of instruction before we create a common lesson plan with their input. Instead of it being that the leadership team is going to say, here's the lesson plan you're going to use, we really want the teachers' input on what's the best format. It might be different from science to social studies to ELA, but at least in that department it would be a common lesson plan based on the needs that they have. So science might have more of an inquiry-based lesson plan, where ELA might have more of a gradual release of instruction type of lesson plan format. The teachers also requested on their PLC days and then days that they have work days that they really wanted to be able to spend some time in their classrooms or with their colleagues doing lesson planning and working on the work. So we hope that that release time strategy in the plan will help support the needs of the teachers within Schuyler Central High School. And then, of course, the coaching of instructional strategies. It can't be let's do a professional development in your PLC and then go back and utilize it. We have to make sure that we're closing that feedback loop, that we're not only talking about it in PLCs, but we're talking about it in our departments, and we're talking about it whenever we're doing the coaching sessions on a weekly basis with each of the teachers. Again, hoping that we can get in classrooms daily, and then sharing that information, those updates with the school board on how we're doing with this instructional leadership goal is important to the school board there as well. The part that I am really impressed with working with the Schuyler Central High School team is just the partnerships that have truly come to the table that want to support and help, not in a we're going to tell you way, but we want to learn from you way. We want you to learn from us, but we also want to learn from you. And you'll see just the list that I've written there as far as partnerships are concerned. The members of the community and the high school and the business leaders were all there during the diagnostic review and were loud and clear. Any support that they could provide, they just want to be there to provide that. The Board of Education has been fabulous. As I shared with you, the school board chair came to our diagnostic review creation day as we were creating the plan, provided support, provided input. He came today as well, so he's there to support whatever processes that need to be in place so that we can create that systematic way to ensure school improvement. Their central office staff has their superintendent, their curriculum and instruction leader, just a phone call away. I've had several questions over the last month that I just pick up the phone and they're always there, or they call me right back within, at least 10 hours, 5 to 10 hours. So they've just been really good about that. They respond to email most of the time. It's better to pick up the phone to call them. The ESU 7 has been just a remarkable partner as well, again, being there to help lead the process and then eventually take over the process of support through the Priority School Partnership. And then your agency has been absolutely fabulous to work with through the creation. It was a quick turnaround, but they've been there every step of the way. The 3 people that you see sitting here, the commissioner, the deputy commissioner, as well as many other staff members, and many are going to continue to help support that as well. So that has to put a smile on your face from a state board agency when an outside consultant can say to you, wow, you have lots of people who want to ensure the success of students within your state. Makes my heart feel really good, and I know it does yours as well. And then Discovery Education is another partner that Schuyler Central High School has been, they've been servicing the school for the last couple of years, not just Schuyler High School, but also with the SIG grant with the middle school. And so they're also a partner in this process and have been really good for taking phone calls, and we want to ensure that their consultants that come in are also utilizing the same instructional language that we are coaching. So we'll be having constant conversation with them through this process of this partnership as well. So I will turn it over to my colleagues here to see what I've left out of this process before we take any questions that you might have or comments.
I don't think so. I think that was pretty comprehensive, Dr. Kennedy.
Today, and so would like to have each of them share one of their things, and then we'll let you take questions.
Okay.
Molly, you want to start?
I just wanted to bring out something that wasn't in the PowerPoint. I thought it was interesting that Superintendent Hazing said safety and security of these students was a priority. And he said their environment is totally non-punitive, and that he hired this new individual to come in to handle behavioral concerns. And the reason I bring this up is I think some of these kids are coming from kind of a uncertain place, if they're refugees and they're new to the town and don't know anyone, and if they're English learners, they don't even speak the language. So I just thought that was really very important as a component of this type of priority school, that we need to learn that should be across the state, that safe, secure schools where students' behavior is expected to improve and that it's supportive, not punitive.
Thank you.
Lisa?
I just commend you for, everybody being involved in coming up with this process.
Is your microphone on?
Of course not.
Yeah, it is. So I applaud you for getting everybody on board with that. But what I really appreciated hearing this morning was the buy-in from the leadership. Superintendent Hazing said he didn't only want to do this for the high school, he's got all the other buildings on board, and which creates consistency in moving forward. I thought that was great. I told you, I noted that there were several reports that were going to be before the board at 4 or 5 or 6, and I thought, whoa, and you said that was generated from the board. They wanted this each month. So this buy-in by the people involved in this, even though they had an improvement process in place before you began, you didn't scrap what they had. You added on and come up with this wonderful thing for students. And so I'm excited for them. So it should be great.
Rachel?
I'm excited for us.
Yes.
Because I think my takeaway from the committee discussion, and again, you just reinforced it in your presentation, I kind of have 3 takeaways that are for us as a state board and around our processes as it relates to our priority school designation, but more importantly to our process of raw classification in the EBA. And I think one of those, we should probably think a little bit more and take a better look at our EBA and determine, are we looking at some strategies and encouraging that schools are using English language acquisition or evidence-based strategies across curriculum areas. I think that was a really important flag that was brought up as one of their goals, but one that would be important for us to look at in any school that serves a large number or percentage of EL students. I think the other piece was how we think about how we look at graduation, so to speak, for those students who come in at 18 years old and sometimes 19 years old and have no formal education prior to entering school. It's not realistic that they'll be in a 4-year cohort. So even though they're classified as a freshman, they're going to turn 21. They're going to age out before a 4-year period of time even occurs. So I think we need to do a little thinking around that and understand that piece and how that piece can impact part of our raw classification. I think the third element for me that was a takeaway is the discussion around deportation and dropouts. And I think that's another important discussion we should have around dropouts. How do we think about and working with students who have dropped out for reasons that are out of their control, truly out of their control? And yes, there are avenues to think about, but I think that was another takeaway for me, that those are some things that they will focus on, but there are some things, in particularly those last 2 items, that are still out of the control of the school in many of our schools across the state.
A couple of the things that I was very impressed with was, one, they are so encouraging to their students to retain their native language, as well as being English language learners. And we all know through research that being bilingual, you have more brain cells. And so they say. And that, this really gives these young people a step higher on the ladder of being employable, because they have that second language. And they encourage them to have that second language. The computer programs that they use with the kids can be translated. And Superintendent Hazing said today the majority of his language is Spanish, but there's 17 dialects that these kids speak. And so that was a real takeaway for me. Also, the fact that they're working with the University High School and putting together some accelerated programs for these older students that are coming in, so that they can get employable skills before they're 21, and they want to go to school. That's why they're there. He said his mobility rate is less than 12%. Now, we don't say that about a lot of our schools in having that low of a mobility rate, so. I triggered something here.
Yeah, I did. You mentioned language. They're starting a brand-new dual language program, K-5 this year, and they believe that they're the only school in the state that the kids can take a biliteracy test and get recognized for that. So, yes, you did trigger it.
I did. Okay, do my other board members have questions? John?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you and your team. Just a couple quick comments in regards to the CTE initiatives that you briefed in regards to getting the school together with the community for their future needs. Has Corey Epler been up there with the revision process?
We're in the process, yes, sir.
Is he
It's
in the
part of
process
plan.
right now
Yes,
of
sir.
working with him?
Yes, sir.
Outstanding. And thank you very much for your comments on English language learners. We got 22% of Nebraskans right now that are considered English language learners in the state. What do you think the percentage is in Schuyler?
We actually figured that out one time. It was,
It's over 90, isn't it?
Yeah, it's, no, I'm not sure on the exact figure.
Not a
I'm sorry.
problem.
Yeah.
Not a problem. Last question I have is regards to, is so important the updates and the progress that Schuyler is making in regards to their progress. Who provides the Board of Education the information, the analysis, the results, and so forth? What team and where provides that information?
so through the priority school process, one of the things that we do is we collect artifacts to show the board, whenever we do the presentation in June, how we've done on each of the strategies. So we'll be collecting artifacts as the year progresses, and that will be the principal, the assistant principal, and
Okay.
the superintendent. And they will provide those updates to the board. When we met in July, Superintendent Hazing said that he wanted the principal and the assistant principal to provide those updates to him, and then he would determine who would be providing that for the board. But they will be on the board documents, which is a public place that anybody can go and see those documents, and he wants to make sure that that's very transparent, and so does the board. So
Will it be
I think
something like
it'll
a
be
dashboard
combination.
report?
Right now, it's in like a Google Doc.
Okay.
And they'll just do like an executive summary of
Very
what
good.
they've done for that particular month in each of those three goal areas is kind of how I envision that. And as I was talking to the superintendent, that's kind of, he wants it to be quick, but also informative.
Very good. Thank you.
Rachel?
If I can just quickly interject, they use Spark, and they
Good.
brought that up, they use Spark,
Oh,
and
that's
it'll
right,
be
they
in
did.
Spark and available.
Good.
And so they'll put the documents up in Spark, and you can go to their website to get to their board materials and board meetings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the other board members up?
Well, I don't want to sound too critical, but, you know, we just took Druid Hill off our list. One of the things I worried about on the Druid Hill was, you know, where's the data that shows me that they've really improved? As I look at this plan, your plan, I could substitute, frankly, I could substitute probably half the schools in Nebraska where we've got Schuyler High, Public High School. I could probably substitute it and there'd be a good plan for it. You know, my concern is that as I look at the indicators that you've got here, if I look at page 4, page 8, page 13, page 17, page 21, go to page 13. There is no hard base that says we have, you know, there's nothing measurable there in my mind in numbers that tells me that a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, there's any measurable improvement in the performance of that school in the form of measures. You mentioned a strategic plan that you said they adopted some time ago. You know, I don't know whether that's got any measures in it, but I'm concerned because I don't see any way, you know, it's easy to say, well, gosh, they have, you know, the board's doing a much better job of getting all this information. But that doesn't tell me that we really improved this school over, be it 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. You can give me all the nice platitudes about how things have improved, how people feel better, but in the long run, I want to see something that tells me in 1 year, or 2 years, or 3 years that that they have exceeded some goals, that they've made something that's measurable, that gives me some confidence to believe that I made a good decision in saying we ought to move on to the next priority school. And that bothers me. I don't know what your response is, but that's my concern.
I think that's a very fair concern. What we have seen at the other priority schools is that when we work on these foundational skills of effective schools, when we work on instruction, when we work on understanding the standards that we're supposed to be teaching in the state of Nebraska versus the materials that we have in front of us, when we understand that as teachers and we teach the right stuff the right way to our students, students master that which we teach to them, and then we monitor their progress. We monitor the progress with NWEA map data, with NSCAS, with their performance scales that they utilize, report card grades. All of those are data points that we utilize. It's not just one data point that determines the success or the lack of success of a school, but bottom line is we want to see the numbers going up, which we have seen that at Druid Hill. We've also seen that in Loup County.
But I don't see those numbers. I
We
don't
need to
see
share those
any
numbers
numbers.
with you.
I want to see some numbers. They got to be built into the plan in order
yes,
to
sir.
decide whether we've succeeded in what we're doing. And I think this goes for building the capacity. You know, we've got as a board, not only 3 priority schools, we've got 80-some needs improvement schools. We've got all the ESSA schools that have yet to come before, you know, that we've got to deal with, the needs improvement ones there. And whether we're building capacity or not, I don't know. But I'm just concerned that as we look at things, you know, when we went through our strategic plan, we had to make some adjustments because we decided, hey, there's really nothing in here that is concrete, that has numbers to it. You know, whether it's improvement in ACT scores, there ought to be something to tell me in a very definitive manner that, you know, your efforts over this year and next year and the following year have made some real difference in those individual kids and their growth.
Yes, sir.
And I don't see that here. I'm sorry.
So the last goal under instructional leadership is curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And the assessment is the part that we look at whenever I'm there after they've given like a MAP assessment, for example. We look at the data and we see how many students have met their projected growth goals, how many students did not receive their projected growth goal, and then we determine what tier 2 and tier 3 supports need to be implemented
But I
for
want
the
to know
children.
whether
But
they're
you're
meeting those
wanting to
goals
see that.
today, what those numbers
I
are.
understand that.
So I can judge in
Yeah.
2 years
I
or 3
understand
years
that.
whether they've actually shown
can
any
certainly
improvement.
provide
You know,
that.
page 13, you have some percentage increases, but there's nothing to start with.
Yep, we can certainly provide that for you as a board. And I think you asked for that in June as well, whenever I presented the priority plan updates. And that is our plan for the next, whenever you call for us again to come and share, we'll make sure that we have the quantitative data as well as the qualitative data.
Lisa?
I understand your concerns, Mr. McPherson, and we do want to see growth. But this is their first year, it's a baseline. And all of I think you named 5 or 6 different measures that will be available after this first year or a little after the first year. The data will be there just as it was for Druid Hill and the other schools. They have to start at a baseline, and then they need the strategies in place, the plan in place. It needs to be consistent, it needs to be best practices, and you will see that data. It just does, you can't just label a priority school and say, I want to see improvement. You have to have a baseline and move forward.
Well, I think that baseline means that you gotta have some kind of baseline numbers in order to decide whether you're making any improvement.
They have
Numbers,
that.
right?
And we have
Maureen.
that data, and we can do a better job of getting that to you.
Maureen, did you have a question?
That should be part of the plan.
Well, I'm just certain, Mr. McPherson, that I read in this plan of how many students were proficient, not proficient. And so these indicators of success on page 13 make sense to me that, as Mrs. Fricky said, you know, over time, we need to give them time to develop these to see the scores improve. And I can't find right off what page that was on.
I think it's.
But those
the
numbers were
EL
very
students.
surprising to me, because there were several that were quite low. And so my goal would be, my desire would be to see those coming up each year.
Sure. Well, and we'll get that information to you at the next time that they're here. Does anyone else have anything? Molly?
I just wanted to end on a positive note. One thing that you have done well with KLK Consulting is providing artifacts for other schools. And I must know, when they came today, you could see how hard it is to be a priority school. All the tension's on you. And Superintendent Hazing he complimented the Omaha World Herald. He said it's so nice to have the press show that we are taking the forefront of schools in our similar situation, and the community, the businesses, the families are working together to make a positive impact, not just in Schuyler, but across the state, where we have demographically shifting culture and more English learners. And I would just again ask, when you develop these artifacts, can you make sure that it's easily accessible on the NDE website? Because if I'm in a school right now thinking I have 90% English learners, what is working that's based on research, sound data analysis, and artifacts that can be exemplified? Thank you.
Rachel, did you?
Yeah, I just want to concur with what Molly's saying, how important that is that we understand the process of change that you're putting into place in partnership with all of the priority schools and with Schuyler. And yes, looking at a quantitative process is important, but understanding this qualitative process piece will be of tremendous value for us as we try to work with more schools across the state, because that gives us the understanding of how improvement occurs and what kinds of things have to happen for improvement that will also support the quantitative pieces. So yes, getting the quantitative measures in front are important, but then us also understanding how we got to those quantitative expectations are important, because there might be some things we should be talking about around what kinds of expectations we put in place with our raw classification, and have a deeper understanding of that as well, and that's our responsibility.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much, Matt. Commissioner?
Next agenda item, or, okay. Well, I gotta say thanks to this team. We probably should dismiss them at the very least. And in addition to that, thank you. And one of the things I think, as I sit and listen to the board, also don't take this in the context of all of the other things that are actually gonna be taking place too, as we build the new profile site around each one of these. We're having to identify the comprehensive support and improvement schools, with the data that goes with that. So remember, we're identifying schools that qualify to be priority school with a set of data. That same set of data should be part of the artifacts in which we're actually looking at that in the past. And I think that'll come together. So as I listen to all of you, and it's nice, I always like to say, I wish I could just sit in rooms with people with passion, you know, because it's nice to see people that really care about what's going to happen in Schuyler. And I'm really proud of these processes and proud of how seriously we're taking these processes. So thank you, Dr. Kennedy, and this whole team and everyone that's been working on that. Thanks to the Schuyler team that was here earlier today as well. So
You definitely are pace setters for the nation in supporting schools that maybe they don't realize that they need support, but you're bringing in a partnership, not telling them what they have to do or taking them over. So you're building with their existing resources and truly That is not what typically happens throughout other states. So your passion certainly does come through, and thank you for leading that process.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. Thank you, team. Thank you very much.
So,
We're going to continue on, Commissioner.
yeah, so kind of to come back to the, my part of the agenda anyway, I want to give you the report and updates on rules and a couple other things. You should be quite concerned because I know I can normally speak for a very long time without notes, and I have notes, so I don't know if that's good or bad for everyone. But number one, if you look on the agenda, there's actually an update, a memo on the update on rules. So you'll see on there that we had Rule 93 that was up for public hearing. We also had rule waiting for Rule 9, Rule 71, Rule 72, Rule 24, and then all that were either already approved by the board and waiting either Attorney General or governor's approval. I'm going to hit Rule 23. I know we talked about this in June. Rule 23, dealing with basic skills competency testing of teachers and entry into that program. This board passed that particular rule. It passed the Attorney General, went on to the governor, and as I reported back in June, it didn't look like the governor was going to sign it at that point in time. I sent you an email sometime in the summer saying that the governor wasn't necessarily going to sign that, but we get into a dynamic of what's the best process to kind of restart that. And I think it's the first time this has happened to me as I've been commissioner, so I know it's the first time for some of you as board members perhaps. But looking at those particular processes and what we want to accomplish, I think as I told you in June, one of the concerns, or at least was a discussion about the concern of somehow lowering the standards for the notion of entering the teaching profession, and that, that's a legitimate concern. But I think we were trying to look at it in the context of equity and ensuring that teachers are coming into the teaching profession and thinking about teachers coming from different directions. So we've established a bit of a conversation with our teacher prep institutions about what the next steps might be. We want to be able to lay out that particular plan. What I'll tell you at this moment in time is really looking at how we could use such a basic skills test as part of the entry requirements into our program. And if there was some type of deficit or some type of threshold that they didn't meet, that there'd be some type of way to actually remove that deficit through other ways besides just an assessment. And I think we very much believe in Nebraska that an assessment shouldn't make every decision for someone's life forever, that we should be thoughtful about how those types of things can be addressed. So we want to start that conversation again with you. We definitely have staff working on what that might look like. I will say on the flip side of this, and I know there's been a lot of conversation, probably even pressure on the governor's office to sign that. Well, we pulled that back, so there's not something for them to sign right at this moment in time. But what I will tell you is I'm concerned about those that were somehow caught in the middle of this particular process. And so we've had cases in the past, and this is, I know I've shared with you before, I actually hate to run rules and then run waiver processes beside rules where we have that possibility. There are circumstances in the past in which teachers or folks have had trouble with certain levels of competency on those things, and given certain circumstances or whatnot, that some of those processes can be waived. We'll look at some of that. I can't promise that every one of the circumstances that could exist out there would be addressed by that, but we need a longer term solution, and hence the reason to come back towards I think a more appropriate approach to ensure that entry into the teaching profession is both upheld at a high standard and expectation, but also that it's not completely determined by a singular test. And I think there's some agreement around that particular work. And I know we'll be bringing that stuff back to you and having conversations around not just Rule 23, but I'll probably mess up. I think it's Rule 20 is the other rule that would have some impact by that. So I wanted to give you that update. I also had, we did have hearings on Rule 91 and 92. We got some feedback, and this was around pupil transportation. There was legislation that had been passed that changed the requirements between I want to say, is it now Department of Motor Vehicles? I always forget when we go transportation, motor vehicles, all those things. We actually had the Deputy Director of Department of Motor Vehicles come and testify with some of those concerns. So we'll actually look at that and make sure that we get that synced up with the intentions of the law and see what other things might need to be addressed. All of that will eventually come to you once that rule is ready for your consideration as well. So you'll see that information. And then lastly, not perhaps a rule right at this moment in time, but guidance. If you remember at the June board meeting, which seems like a long time ago, but we had public comment on sunscreen and some requests out of folks in the legislature asking us to give some consideration to how we would provide some guidance to schools around the interpretations of whether sunscreen is a medication. Not that we can change that part of it, but kind of protocol that schools could use to ensure that students could apply sunscreen in a school setting appropriately. And so we've done some work with, and I say we quite loosely because I think it was Brian Halstead and others did work to circulate something with Department of Health and Human Services and others, the Dermatology Association, I believe, and others to set up some guidance. And we're hoping this fall to be able to share that guidance with schools. So that probably concludes what I have on rules. And then I know Ryan has a bit of an update as well.
Well, I am pleased to share some news with you from NASB, the National Association of State Boards of Education, of which this board is a member. The individual membership from this board has been very active in NASB at the national level and continues to be. Patsy is part of the Leading for Equity and Excellence project and continues to participate in that. And I think there's some ongoing meetings and maybe a next in-person meeting in October at the NASB meeting. Maureen is on the ballot for Central Area Director, and so the delegates will vote for that at the meeting in October. Rachel will be on the ballot for Chair, serving as chair-elect now. Is that elected? How does that work? You'll be, roll right into it. Yeah, okay. So we'll plan for Rachel to be the chair, right, in the coming year. I'm still getting all that figured out. Scott is finishing his term on the board as the INCOSIA rep, INCOSIA being the abbreviation for the State School Board Attorneys Association. That's an affiliate to NASB. We are very pleased. You may have seen the press release that came out this week that Commissioner Blumstedt will be recognized as the Policy Leader of the Year for NASB. And so there are other awards forthcoming that NASB is waiting to release their information on, and so I'm sure you'll see those, and we'll be sure that you see those as well. You may have seen from NASB that the registration is open for the conference in Denver, October 17th through the 20th. And so I know that some of you have already requested travel for that, and I wanted to take an opportunity to revisit the out-of-state travel policy, because I know there may be some questions about that, and provide you with some information so that you can feel good that your requests and travel would be within that policy. And so the out-of-state travel policy is that each board member is limited to 2 out-of-state events unless they are serving in a leadership role representing the board or their expenses are covered by NASB or another organization. And then the attendance should be limited to 2 board members at any one national meeting. Additional members may attend if their expenses are covered by NASB or another organization, or if there are circumstances that warrant permitting additional members to attend and such attendance is approved by the board. So essentially, anytime that you approve more than 2 members, you're saying that those circumstances warrant that. I will tell you also from a financial perspective, within the budget, we would take those 2 members out of the state general funds, and then we also have some additional funds from NASB for different projects where travel expenses can come from. And so I'm going to say there's somewhere around $10,000 probably there for travel. And so I think you should feel good about knowing that there are those additional funds that aren't state funds, and knowing what the policy is. If you as a board make a decision that more than 2 people can go, you have the authority to do that because you made the policy in the first place. So again, I share that because I know folks are going to want to start making plans for that, and many of you are going to be going by default.
Rachel?
Yeah, thank you for that, Ryan. And I do want to encourage as many members to go this year, in particularly because of the award process, and for Commissioner Bloomstead to be selected is really quite an honor for us as well. And it is, I think, going to be an excellent conference this year. It's 60th anniversary, so they've really put some additional kinds of elements into the program that I think will find outstanding professional development for us as state board members.
Thank you, Dr. Wise. Appreciate it. Dr. Four, thank you very much, sir. Moving on with our agenda, is there a motion to go into executive session?
I move that the state board go into executive session to discuss investigative proceedings concerning personnel matters.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Dr. Wise. Lisa? Oh. Close enough. Is there any discussion on the motion?
No.
Hearing, seeing none. Denise, please call the roll.
Nichols,
Yes.
O'Halloran,
Yes.
McPherson.
Yes.
Frickie,
Yes.
Wise.
Yes.
Kojans,
Yes.
Tim,
Yes.
and Witzel.
Yes.
8 yes.
Motion passes. The board will now go into executive session only for the purpose of discussing investigative proceedings concerning personnel matters. Let's go.
So moved.
Second.
Is there any discussion on this motion? Seeing and hearing none, Denise, please call roll.
Fricke,
Yes.
Co-Johns,
Yes.
Wise,
Yes.
Witzel,
Yes.
O'Halloran,
Yes.
Tim,
Yes.
Nichols,
Yes.
McPherson.
Yes.
8 yes.
Motion passes. We'll now go to our standing committee reports. Vice President Tim, please report on the policy committee meeting, please.
The policy committee met this morning and approved, we have 2 action items. One is to approve the proposed revisions to State Board Bylaw BP9, Ethics, Accountability, and Disclosure. This has to do with conflicts of interest when we vote on contracts and things. The policy committee recommends the board to approve proposed revisions to P9 tomorrow. Anybody have any questions? It was a very small change. We also. Go on. All right. Okay. We also discussed a proposed resolution on equity in education. If you were at Administrator Days, the commissioner gave an excellent opening on equity in schools, and we are recommending that the board adopt a resolution on equity in education tomorrow at our meeting. And you did receive a copy of that in your materials that you can read through. That's all I have.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you very much. Moving on. Rachel, please report on the legislative committee meeting, please.
Yeah, the legislative committee had a conference call on July 16th and then had our meeting today. One of the things that we did was put together a draft of 2019 legislative priorities and a presentation at Administrator Days to get input from administrators on some of our discussion around legislative priorities. At our meeting this morning, we discussed that really our legislative priorities will probably become a document of legislative and regulatory priorities because of the interface between statutory issues and needs and our regulatory issues and needs. And we'll be bringing a draft to you for September in that process. We also discussed the outline of some of the activities for the upcoming activities for the legislative committee. And we did not have a chance to get to one item that we've asked Brian to just give a little bit of an update, and that's some things that are happening on the federal level. So Brian, if you'd give a little bit of an update to the full board, that would be great.
Good afternoon, Brian Halstead, Deputy Commissioner. On the federal level, it seems sometimes like nothing happens and then all of a sudden everything happens. As you've heard and recall from previous meetings, I told you about how the House had passed reauthorization of Perkins in 2017 and it was waiting the Senate's approval. Well, while Administrator Days week was going on, the Senate took it up and passed it, and then it went back to the House, who then passed what the Senate passed, and on Tuesday, President Trump signed the reauthorization of Perkins into law. So at this point, we're all scrambling to understand exactly what the new Perkins reauthorization involves. Deputy Commissioner Schultz and I sat in on a webinar on Tuesday to get the higher level. There is further detail coming out next week that our staff are going to be fully involved in because they work with it every day. So that's a positive in that regard. The other issue that's going on is that there is funding for the federal government through September 30th, and then they have to come up with their funding. At the moment, the appropriations processes are bringing forward education funding for the programs we're familiar with, either at level funding or some slight increases for IDEA. So we'll keep our eyes on that. Usually this time of year, the House and the Senate are both in their summer recess until September. However, the Senate is coming back in the very near future to work through the rest of August. So we'll keep our eye on that. But at the moment, the appropriations process appears that any funding for education is going to remain largely the same with slight increases in a couple programs. So that's the update from the federal level.
Just a real quick addition on the Perkins. I think you said that it was 8 years past due.
Well, the
and
last,
the reauthorization.
yeah, the last Perkins authorization from Congress was in 2006. So it's a little overdue for reauthorization. So it finally has been reauthorized, so that's good news.
And the next couple of steps with that, also that we just briefly discussed, is that there'll be a state plan that'll have to be developed and probably some stakeholder engagement. So very similar to ESSA from the perspective of process. And we'll hear more later.
Yep.
Thank you. That's it. That's all for our committee.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much, ma'am. Appreciate it. Regards to the Commissioners Appraisal Committee, there will be no report. There was no meeting. Moving on. Maureen, please report on the AQuest Teaching and Learning Domain Committee meeting.
Yes, the Teaching and Learning Domain Committee had 3 action items and 1 discussion item. The first action item is 2.1, to approve the educator preparation programs in Nebraska colleges and universities for 2018 and 2019, through 2019. And the list of programs is attached in Spark if you haven't seen it yet, want to look at it. And the committee has asked Pat Madsen to come up and share just a bit about it.
For the record, I am Pat Madsen, in the Office of Accountability, Accreditation, and Program Approval. I finally got that figured out. You received this attachment with, in your board materials. Every year, the institutions submit to our office by May 15th the list of endorsement program offerings they are planning for this next upcoming year, and that is compiled then into this chart. If they have a new program, we do now have a pre-approval process where they have to meet with us before the 15th of June and explain like the rationale for starting that program and what all the things they have in place to start that program. We haven't had many institutions that are starting new programs, but Concordia University did go through this process because they are starting a school counseling program this year.
The committee recommends approving this action item. Board members, committee members, are there any questions? Okay. Thank you, Pat.
Okay. I should say too that we also had 4 of our institutions that went through the state approval process this spring, and all have been recommended through NCTE to be approved for the next 7-year cycle. And those are held usually in conjunction with the national accreditation visits if the institutions are nationally accredited, and 13 of our 15 institutions are. You probably noticed that Grace University is no longer on the list. So, okay, thank you.
Okay, the committee also discussed item 2.2, an action item to grant the commissioner authority to contract with an individual yet to be named for a period beginning on or after August 6th, 2018 through July 31st, 2019 for the purpose of directly supporting principals, principal supervisors, superintendents, and other school leaders. And we'd like Brad Dirksen to share some comments on this to explain it further for you.
Yes, thank you. I'm Brad Dirksen, the administrator for the Office of Accountability, Accreditation, and Program Approval. Give a little background. In 2016, the Nebraska Department of Education accepted an invitation from CCSSO to participate in the Wallace Foundation's ESSA Leadership Learning Community, otherwise known as ELLC. The purpose of the ELLC was to foster collaboration to determine how to use funds available to support education leaders in their state and local plans. And through these discussions, the Nebraska ELC is looking to create a sustainable coaching, learning, and improvement network of principals and their direct supervisors, which also often includes superintendents. In order to create this network, we're requesting the board to grant the commissioner the authority to contract with an individual who would then shoulder the primary responsibility for driving the development, implementation, and improvement of Nebraska's network.
Okay, thank you. The committee recommends approving this action item. Are there any questions from anyone? Lisa?
I thought of one. I'm sorry I didn't think of it earlier.
No, okay, it's on. You mentioned the word sustainable, so I think this is a wonderful idea. Can you participate again after 1 year through this same ELLC program?
Yeah.
Can you do this on a sustainable basis through this same group, or do you have to apply for a different type of grant, or how does this become sustainable? Because I think it's a wonderful idea.
Yeah, the ELLC is a project with CCSSO and the Wallace Foundation. It was authorized for the last 2 years, and there's also a reauthorization for an additional 2 years. So the ELLC is going to be around for 2 more years for sure.
Good.
What we're trying to do from the ELLC work is create our own sustainable Nebraska network. When this person is identified to contract with, part of their responsibility is to create a sustainable system. And they're working with our ELLC committee, which is a diverse committee, to help make sure that is a sustainable process. The idea is to focus on needs improvement schools, especially so those principals and principal supervisors can get that additional support.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Anyone else?
It sounds like this is kind of similar to what OPS is doing with, they've got like 4 supervisors that work with principals. Is it not similar to that? And have you thought about having any discussion with them on how they're doing with it? And is there any overlap with what we anticipate we're going to do with what OPS is currently doing in that
I can
regard?
probably help Brad. Brad gets to enter this space a little bit new on this, but that's exactly who's been working with us on the ELLC. So Omaha Public Schools has been a part of that process, as have ESUs, as have others. And really what we're impressed by, and I think, Sharice Williams from Druid Hill actually became a bit of a national model. I mean, she was able to go and have conversations with this particular group. And I think they're even looking at coming to Nebraska and looking at the work that we're actually doing around this, thinking about how we can take and really enhance. And I was really glad to have the conversation in committee around superintendents supervise a lot of our principals. But how do we get better and better at that principal support? How do we get better and better at principal supervision? And Omaha's really been side by side with us on this, thinking about how we can grow that as a model. And Brad already highlighted it, but some intentionality around providing that, in particular around needs improvement schools, where we think leaders really are there to going to make a difference in those settings if we can really be focused on instruction. So we're excited for this type of approach to roll out, and it's really built on a lot of Nebraska capacities on how we can move that forward. And really a lot of credit in our conversations with OPS for being a partner all along. I think Larry M. Polk from ESU 7 has been a partner all along, but many others. In fact, Dr. Kennedy's been involved in some of those conversations too. So we're trying to bring that together to think about, scaling up essentially the work that we think is so important across all of our needs improvement schools.
Thank you, Brad. And the committee also discussed item 2.3, an action item to approve Nebraska Student-Centered Assessment System, NSCAS, mathematics cut scores for grades 3 through 8, and NSCAS alternate mathematics cut scores for grades 3 through 8 and 11. And we definitely need Valerie Foy and Jeremy Henniger to present some information to the full board.
I'm just going to offer one point of clarification. Maureen's talking about the numbering for the agenda on the committee agenda. This is actually item 3.4.c, just to confuse everybody a little more. So,
my bad.
Hi, I'm Valerie Foy. I'm Director of Statewide Assessment.
Jeremy Henniger is Assistant Director.
We're here to talk with you about setting the cut scores for the NSCAS mathematics tests. And so we will give a presentation on that.
Sure.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, we just got back from kind of a whirlwind tour, as you know, obviously, because many of you were there. We had administrator days last Wednesday with the timing that NWA could get us scores back and trying to make sure we got to this board meeting so that you could hopefully take action tomorrow. We had to meet with teachers on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday last week. And then the vendors got us the reports back up by end of business day on Tuesday or Monday. We presented to the commissioner on Tuesday, and now we're here before you. And so it's been kind of a whirlwind trying to get this done, so then we can turn around reports and get those out to everybody. So. And this, we just kind of want to go through a little bit of history. Actually, about a year ago, we presented most of this information to you before, just about what standard setting is, just so everybody's on the same page. In the previous standard setting process, or the standard setting process in general, basically what we're determining are the ranges for scores on an assessment and what students need to get to fall into the performance level or categories. In the previous standard setting, we were using exceeds, meets, and below for the 3 categories. Universally across the content areas, with the exception of writing, math, reading, and science, you needed a 135 to be in the exceeds category or higher, and you needed an 85 to be in the meets. And those were the cut scores, and that's what we're gonna be talking about today. And so those were common between those assessments, and it was on a 200-point scale. Also previously, when we brought the teacher panels together to do their work and to make a recommendation, the question that they ask is, what does a barely proficient student need to know? The reason we highlight that is because we're asking very different questions, and our scales and everything look very different, and we'll kind of get to that as we go to this. As I've said before, standard setting, when do you do this? It's whenever you do the first year of assessment, right? Or when a test changed significantly. So this is the first year of operational math for the college and career ready. So this last year we did ELA and we had ACT. This year we're changing to math, so that's why we're here doing it this year. And that was caused by a couple of different things: the passage of the college and career ready Nebraska standards for mathematics, and then the change in rigor, right? When we moved to college and career ready, that rigor changed. Also the expansion of item types. Previously it was only multiple choice. Now we're doing technology enhanced items, drag and dropped, and those types of things. There's a whole series of those. And so those things all come together to change the test, so we have to have this standard setting or cut score process. Also important to note that standard setting doesn't just happen afterwards. And actually standard setting has to happen after a large scale assessment, oftentimes the summer after you do the event. But the design of that and everything starts much earlier, even when we're developing the test itself. So we had psychometricians giving us input all along the way. The Governor's Technical Advisory Committee, which has 3 additional psychometricians on it, gave us advice on that. The Assessment and Accountability Advisory, which is a group made up of educators, lots of different types of educators, superintendents, district assessment contact, principals, teachers. They had input, and of course NDE in that process. And the whole process is a judgmental process based on content. So when the teachers were here making a recommendation, they were looking at content. They were actually looking at the items on the test and to give us their judgment and to help us make this decision. I already said that, so I'll go on.
So last year, the cut scores for it hadn't been named NSCAS yet, but for the new College and Career Ready ELA tests were brought before you. And so normally we wouldn't be back, we would not have checked those. You set those in the first year of a new test. But we had a little bit of change in our test. First of all, it changed to being an adaptive test, so that was a slight change in it. And we also were moving to a vertical scale. So I'm going to talk about the vertical scale a little more later. But because we went to an adaptive test, we had to do a validation of those cut scores that were set last year. So we brought in an entirely new team of teachers at every single one of those grades, 3 through 8. And they went through a standard setting process and checked it against last year's after they had independently first done the process and determined that those cut scores would stay where they were set last year. So they really validated last year's process, and we were very pleased to see that. As you know, there was a drop in the proficiency rates in the state from between 70 and 80 down to around in the 50s, and so we were very pleased that this process was validated and those cut scores did remain where they were. So we thought that spoke a lot to the movement we're moving forward in the rigor of those standards and of that being embedded in our schools. Next, the cut scores were aligned to a vertical scale. So Jeremy just showed you our horizontal scale. It's what was used on our old assessments, and an 85 was passing, a 135 was exceeds, and that was the same in every single grade. So if a third grader earned an 85 in reading, and then the next year as a fourth grader earned an 85 in reading, we determined that was a year's growth. But that was very confusing for policymakers and for parents and the public. Oh, if they had 0 score growth, that's good. And so we wanted to build a vertical scale where there would be a difference in the number. So if you look at the very last point on this slide, we designed it to show growth across the years. So the 2,220 is the very lowest point on this scale. So that is where third graders will start. And so the range for third graders is lower than the range for fourth graders, which is lower than the range for fifth graders. And it'll move right up through this scale. It's eighth graders that would be able to attain the 2,890. So literally, a student will have vertical growth, and one would be able to do a subtraction process and say, this is how many points this student grew. And we think that this will be very helpful in measuring growth and interpreting those scores. Now, the score ranges that were selected there, 2,220 to 2,890, are designed because MAP growth also uses a vertical scale, and our educators really like the vertical scale on MAP growth, and it's one of the reasons we wanted to use a vertical scale. MAP growth uses a 3-digit number to measure growth, and we did not want to confuse our educators and parents between MAP growth and growth on the NSCAS test, because they're not the same test, so they can't be put on the same scale. And so that's why we actually selected a 4-point range in ELA, and you'll see that in math also.
So just to kind of walk you through a couple of pieces of the process, included over 85 educators over 7 days, 3 days for general and 4 days for alternate. The panelists used proficiency or achievement level descriptors. We call them PLDs in the past, proficiency level descriptors. We've changed the name because we've changed the specificity of those, and they're more specific than they used to be. And test content to recommend cut scores. The achievement level descriptors were also written by Nebraska educators as well, Nebraska educators all along the way. There's multiple rounds of recommendations and discussions along the way before they make that final recommendation. It includes access to impact data to inform their decision, and they also have a process at the end that they look across the grade levels to make sure there's some consistency across those grade levels, that you don't have widely varying, because you wouldn't expect a large number to be proficient and then drop and then come back and forth. Those should be pretty consistent, not exactly the same from year to year, but there should be some consistency.
So last year, the state board voted on the performance levels for the ACT, and the names that were used at that time when you voted on them, the ACT performance levels, the top level was the ACT benchmark, the middle level was on track, and the third level, the lowest level, was developing. An ACT benchmark and on track, both are levels that are passing or proficient on this test. Last year, ELA names were also brought to the board. And we had had input from different departments at the Nebraska Department of Ed, and we had also sought input into the naming of them from school districts and from our AAA. However, the board wanted us to go back and get input from parents. So instead of using those names, you use the levels 1, 2, and 3 as placeholders, with 1 and 2 being the highest. So we did a process this year where we ran between 8 and 10 parent focus groups across the state. So brought in small groups of parents. We took in information about different names that they could select. We did share what the ACT performance levels were, and we discussed the definitions of what each of the levels would mean. And there was a great deal of concurrence on what the levels would be named. And the parents really, overall, in all of the meetings, supported the highest level being college and career ready benchmark, the middle level being on track, and the lowest level being developing. They really like that consistency between the naming of the grades 3 through 8 and the naming of the ACT 11th grade at the high school. And so that was their main reason for liking those names the best. They really did not, on our old standards, we had below, meets, and exceeds. They felt these names were very encouraging because they did not like the terminology below. They felt that that was very discouraging to students and to parents. So they really liked the names developing, on track, and benchmark for that reason. So here are the performance level descriptors. They are for both ELA and mathematics. So the college and career benchmark learners demonstrate advanced proficiency. The on-track learners demonstrate proficiency, and developing learners do not yet demonstrate proficiency in the college and career ready standards.
Just, and make sure everybody caught this, the CCR benchmark and on track are proficient, and the developing is non-proficient, so the top 2 are proficient. Like we said, we have the recommendations here for you today for mathematics general 3 through 8, and alternate 3 through 8 and 11, 2 cuts per each grade, 1 cut between each of the levels to give us 3 levels. That vertical scale for general. The alternate is a temporary scale, and we should mention this now. Alternate only serves about 1% of our students, and so because it's that small group of students, we can't put that on a vertical scale to show growth, because to do that you have to have a lot more items in a test to do that and to show that across years, and so we just can't get to that point without creating a pretty big burden on those individual students that are already dealing with lots of other things in their lives, and so we just can't do that on the alternate. And the question that we asked the teachers last Thursday, Friday, and Saturday wasn't what is barely proficient, right? We asked them this question: what does a student that is on track to be college and career ready need to know and be able to demonstrate? Those are very different questions. What is barely proficient? What is on track to be college and career ready? The standards are college and career ready standards. What we could expect, right? So we don't have data here for you because we have to get these cut scores done first. But what we can expect is anytime you raise rigor, raise expectations, the number of students that are going to be proficient at the start of that usually goes down. That's kind of a universal. That's what happened last year with ELA and ACT. That's what we can probably expect this year in math as well. As we move forward, the good news is what happens typically in most places, and definitely in Nebraska, as we adjust to that new reality, as kids have more time in the system and as teachers adapt curriculum and instruction, those numbers tend to go up over time and we tend to see growth. So the numbers that we're going to put in front of you, so the cut score recommendation, the numbers between CCR benchmark and on track are there before you. You'll see that the vertical scale can show you that it starts at a lower level and moves up through the 8th grade. The on track and developing cuts are there as well. You see the same pattern. One thing that you might see that there's not an equal increment between grades. That's because there's not necessarily equal amount of learning that happens between each of those. When we put that together on a scale, The statisticians and the psychometricians come in and say, here's the range that the scale needs to be to show the growth over time, and we put those into place. So those are the numbers for math. The numbers for alternate is on a different scale. Like I said, it's not the vertical scale. This is a temporary scale, and we'll transform that into a common scale once we get your approval. But those are the numbers that we're recommending.
Thank you.
Mhm.
The committee does recommend approving this
Microphone.
action item. Does anybody have any questions? The committee does recommend approving this action item, and does anybody have any questions? Okay, moving on. Thank you, Jeremy and Valerie, I appreciate it. Finally, the committee had one discussion item, 3.4D, related to the civic readiness definition. And the committee's preference was to not move the definition of civic readiness forward at this time. Rather, the committee discussed developing a definition of college, career, and civic readiness, rather than defining civic readiness in isolation. The committee felt like this would provide necessary clarification and set expectations on what is meant by college, career, and civic readiness. It was also discussed a need for the Strategic Planning Committee to re-examine Goal 5.1 in the strategic plan. Committee members, do you have anything that you would like to add? Pat, Rachel, or Lisa? Okay. Patrick, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I guess we went through some angst in this over the last year, and certainly if we're going to follow your recommendation, we're going to have to change the strategic plan. I'm a little reticent to say that we ought to be changing the strategic plan. I guess I'm going to want to think about that. So,
Rachel?
Our discussion today, I think, was a really important discussion that we tend to use college, career, and civic readiness together. And so to define one element, though it's not taking away what's been done so far, it's really looking at college and career and civic readiness. And we had a really in-depth discussion on the importance of understanding the commonality of that definition for us as a starting point, and then determine where we're moving with those definitions, college ready, career ready, and civic ready as a part of the process. But to take one out and not to examine the other two elements of college, career, and civic ready is maybe a little bit of a disservice in not putting it in context of all three. The only discussion about looking at the strategic plan was that we put civic readiness in isolation, and we didn't as a strategic plan, though we talk about college and career and civic ready, we didn't talk about ensuring that we had definitions for college, career readiness as well. So that was really what the discussion was about today.
And I'd just like to add too that my recollection when we came up with our strategic plan and voted on it was that there may be a time or two down the road that we may need to look at what we've come up with and maybe tweak it a bit or redefine something. So I feel like this fits under that parameter unless my memory is gone awry. Mr. President, this
Thank you, Mo.
concludes my report.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Appreciate it. Molly, please report on the AQuest Student Success and Access Domain Committee meeting, please.
Okay. Let's start with 3.5A. The committee discussed accepting Improving Student Health and Academic Achievement Grant. The amount of this grant is $365,000 per year for 5 years. The committee recommends accepting this grant. Board members, any questions or comments? Item 3.5B, the committee recommends granting the commissioner the authority to contract with the Children's Hospital and Medical Center Foundation in the amount of $65,000 and $65,764 for 1 year. The committee recommends accepting this grant. Board members, any questions? Okay, let's go to the next item, 3.5C. The committee recommends approving the list of early childhood education programs in the appended list in Spark in accordance with the provision of Rule 11. Board members, any questions on this item? All right, let's move to 3.5D. This is to approve Morrill Public Schools Early Childhood Program. The committee has asked Melody Hobson to provide more information on this item. Melody?
Good afternoon. I am Melody Hobson. I'm the administrator of the Office of Early Childhood Education. And what makes this approval a little bit different is, as you can see in your rationale document, that Morrill Public School met all of the requirements of Rule 11 except for the teacher requirements. Last summer, they informed the Office of Early Childhood that while they had had a preschool program for a number of years, they were adding infant toddler childcare program. That was something that they felt that their community needed. And at that time, we told them, we gave them about 3 options. We said, this is what Rule 11 says. It does include childcare. These are the definitions. You can get all of your teachers with a teaching certificate by the end of June. You can contract this out to a community entity, or work with somebody else so that it is a licensed program, or help us come up with a third option. They were not able to hire teachers, so we have worked with them kind of throughout the year, and then with the introduction in the legislature of LB 803, which provides waivers, as yet to be determined, specifically for the teacher certification requirement. The fact that the board supported LB 803 is the rationale for asking for approval for Morrill Public Schools for the next year. And within this year, at this time, we are sending out a survey to all school districts. We're asking for a significant amount of input about their experience with early childhood and getting certified teachers, their experience with waivers in Rule 10. And so we will be coming back in a few months to talk about some proposed wording for a waiver.
Board members, any questions or discussion on this item? Yes.
This waiver is just for a year?
Yes. It's not technically a waiver, it's just approving them for a year.
And you're working with them, okay.
I'm not opposed to doing this, but as I said in the meeting, we're really violating our own policy by what we're doing right now.
Yes.
And if we're going to do that, you indicated that you believe that we could have a rule or a draft of a waiver policy available by November. If you can do that, I'm satisfied in voting on this. But I do, and again, I'm not opposed to what we're trying to get accomplished here. But I think, we've got to pretty much follow our own rules and follow policy and the law. So thank you.
I appreciate that.
The committee does recommend approving the Morrill Public Schools Early Childhood Program,
Molly, I got a quick question.
Go ahead.
Millie, are we indeed violating our own policy?
The Rule 11 right now says that if they don't meet the requirements, that the board may not approve them.
Yes, ma'am.
So, yes, in practice, because this has not come before the board before, given the fact that 803 did pass. We have more flexibility than we have had. We don't have the corresponding, we've not been able yet to create the corresponding rule by the end of June that would have kind of kept them out of this
So in other words,
position.
we were acting in good faith for this school district.
So, may I, actually, I guess.
Yeah,
I need to
Patsy?
Well, I think the most important part of the discussion is what would be best for the kids in this year period, for them to have a school that's operating and on its way, or should we just stick by this pretty hazy period and make the school and the kids suffer for that because it didn't all work out altogether. And so I guess in the end, if we're really all about kids, it would be pretty clear that we should vote for this.
I want to let you all know that as the waiver kind of stands in this temporary manner, is they are being encouraged to get their certification. So we're not leaving the children in the lurch. Pat?
This is a discussion that has been going on within the commission for this last year and a half, and I think this will, how to address a situation like this or to shore up things or whatever, is going to come out of the action plan of the commission that will have some real direction then, because there is a real concern about teachers being qualified.
So actually, the commission will help advise the rulemaking.
Yeah.
And that'll be before next June.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, and I believe, Commissioner, you had a comment.
Well, I think probably, unfortunately, now I'm just reiterating things, but, you know, this notion for us, as we went through that history, had a lot of conversations with policy partners around the state, even when LB 803 was being passed and heard, and there was a lot of dialogue at that point in time. So I think we're carrying out the intent of the law, even though we're a little bit behind relative to having all the rule process in place, and and I think that's a good plan relative to where we're at this moment in time for the benefit of students there, for the benefit of these programs. And this is the only one actually that's going to be approved this year underneath that. Yeah.
All right, looks like we have all questions answered. Let's go to the next item. This is 3.5E, to grant the commissioner the authority to continue with agreement between the Iowa Board of Regents, the state of Iowa, on behalf of the Iowa School for the Deaf and the Nebraska Department of Education for providing services to Nebraska children and youth. Does anybody have any questions about this? One thing I was going to say that was kind of cool, it seems like we're getting regional support for our students that are suffering being deaf. And there are only 4 of our students in Iowa. Wasn't that surprising? That are here. But it was a great presentation, and I'm glad that that's happening. And our committee did vote to recommend approval. Let's now go to, yes?
Guess I go to you.
Yeah.
I did have a note. Which?
Microphone.
So I
Intend on finding what I had. On page 2, is there someone, maybe you can answer this because I wasn't in your meeting. It says summer school services, it talks about outreach. Do we know, is this what these outreach services would be?
I don't believe any of the real experts are in the room right now, but my recollection is they were talking about regional outreach that we're doing now in Nebraska, trying to fill the spaces. They used to all be at the Nebraska School of the Deaf, and we closed that school, and now Iowa School of the Deaf is operating, taking Nebraska students, but the regional resources are going to offer something so that kids can stay with their families in school districts. Commissioner, you probably have more fill on that.
Well, I think that's essentially right. We're also in part of the agreement is trying to make sure that those regional services are provided and trying to look at ways that we accomplish that. So that's the intention.
I think this is a great thing that the states are working together, because I know vocational rehab works with Iowa. I just think those partnerships. And then one more question on page 3, and again, you might not be able to answer it. It talks about miscellaneous terms. What happens to a student who is excluded from the program does that student go back to the home district or another state agency that helps with behavioral problems? Would that be, like one of our Nebraska students is at the Iowa facility, and it talks about behavioral issues, and they are excluded. Do they go back to a home district, or do they go to an agency?
I think there'd be a lot of scenarios I could walk you through, right? I think that's in there with, just in case something were to happen. There are protocols for that it would determine on that place. A lot of scenarios. It's
So
hard for me
it's
to
not one
generalize.
set rule, it
Yeah,
depends
it's hard,
on the
very hard to
situation.
generalize, yeah.
Okay.
There'd be an IEP and other things involved.
Okay, that's what
All right.
Thank you.
Always, what I really wanted to also say, Commissioner Bloomstead, it seems like years ago now, but I loved it when you always say, it's every student every day. And our students with disabilities have great futures as well. And so it seems that these action items are really appealing to those students with those types of disabilities. All right, let's move to the next one.
I just saw Steve Milligan walk in.
Yeah, Steve, do you want to talk more specifically about that?
Yeah, I didn't hear all the conversation.
So if you did have they were.
Lisa, do you want to express your question on the last item again? Or do you
Well,
want to go like the
I
first
think
one?
I got an answer from
Okay.
Rachel, that they would go back to their home district, and they would take care of the behavioral type things that the student needs.
Correct.
The home district still has a level of responsibility with students that are contracted out. I think that was the discussion, is what if
Contracted
they
out to
had-
ISD?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and so if there were issues there, that doesn't preclude the homeschool from having a responsibility of next steps, IEP planning,
Right.
whatever might be needed.
And many of the students that don't go to ISD are provided the regional supports in the local
Right.
districts and so forth, whatever those needs may be for that particular student, and with a few students going to ISD.
Now, oftentimes those regional outreach goes through the ESUs.
Yes, our regional services work with our service
Yeah.
units as well.
And do we really work to promote equity and access, so all the ESUs do provide the same opportunities for our deaf and blind
Absolutely.
students?
And across all school
Yeah,
districts.
that's wonderful.
Yep.
Okay, well, let me look again. Any other questions or comments?
I might have just a couple questions. You indicated that we have only 4 students there,
Correct.
and they are all high school students.
Correct. In fact, I
And-
believe they're even in transition age, which is 18 to 21.
So, I guess apparently the needs for these students that are not in high school are being met locally, is that right?
Exactly.
And do we look to a point where maybe this contract isn't necessary, or, the needs are being met at the local level so that we don't need to be, housing and educating these children under this program in Iowa?
Good question. Right now, I don't know the exact numbers over the years, but that 4 is pretty low compared to what the need has been over the years. So I don't necessarily, if we don't have the need, then, we are down to 4, then we wouldn't do that contract, but we also work closely with, like the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Association and so forth, and so are very animate about and supportive of us continuing to look to ISD for services. If the need's not there, absolutely, but
Yeah.
I anticipate us always having the need for that kind of service. I would be surprised if otherwise.
Commissioner?
Yeah, I would just add, I think the relationship's actually a really positive one. So when we have students that would need that type of setting and is appropriate for their particular needs, it gives us that advantage. And I don't know the history very well, but when Nebraska did shut down our own school, I think this was very much part of the conversation at the time, was we could do that because there would be the Iowa school to be able to to use when appropriate. And so I think for our purposes, you know, it could be next year we could have, I mean, pick a number, there could be a substantially larger number of students that would be appropriate to be in that setting. And so we just want to make sure that we have those options always.
Exactly.
One other point that was brought up at our meeting earlier today is that those high school students have different independent needs than the grade school kids. So you have a student from pre-K to 8 that's deaf, might be better served with his own family. But some of those high school kids feel isolated because they can't hear, and when they go to the school for the deaf, they feel like other people are in the same situation. So
Yes.
I think it's kind of more like going to college or something. It's for those older students.
Depends on the student, obviously, depends
Yeah.
on the supports and whatever that may be, absolutely.
Well, if there are no more questions, the committee does support this action item. We'll move to the next one.
Thank you.
Okay, the next one is finally item 3.5G to grant conditional approval under Rule 14 for applicant non-public schools to operate in the 2018-19 school year. The two schools are on the attached list. The committee recommends granting conditional approval to these non-public schools. Any questions or comments? All right. Committee members, did I miss anything? John?
You might want to review 3.5.F.
Okay. That is to grant the commissioner authority to fund the 3 projects listed in the agenda. And 3.5F is, let me get,
Grant the
Autism.
commissioner.
yeah, the autism spectrum.
Yes.
My notes didn't have that specificity, but the autism spectrum presentation at our committee meeting was awesome too.
Right.
Because in order to really maximize the potential of those kids, this is a very important action item. Any questions? The committee did all support this action item.
Thank you very much,
You're
Molly.
welcome.
I will be report on the Budget and Finance Committee meeting. If I could have Bryce and Shane come up and report on the biennial budget request.
Good afternoon, Shane Ryan, Budget and Operations Officer.
And Bryce Wilson, Administrator of Financial and Administrative Services.
So we had the opportunity to present the first draft of the biennial budget request for the next 2 fiscal years to the Budget and Finance Committee this afternoon. And if you'll bear with me for just one moment. I have a PowerPoint presentation put together to walk through some significant amounts in our biennial budget request for the upcoming 2 years. All right. So supporting education in Nebraska is a $3.7 billion expenditure annually. For the 16-17 school year, on the AFRs collected by the department for the 244 public school districts, they expended almost $3.7 million out of their general fund for educational purposes. The Department of Education's operating budget for that same time period was about $45 million, or 1.2% of that enterprise. So that gives you a feel for the size and scope of our budget related to what is going on in the school districts across the state. This is some information on the receipts by the school districts across the state. 56% of those receipts come from local dollars. About 37% come from NDE flow-through, state general funds, TIOSA, special education, various other programs. About 5.6% comes through federal funds from the department, IDEA, ESSA, and career technical education. And about 0.5% each from other receipts and county receipts fund the school districts. The legislature appropriates funds to the department in 8 specific budget programs. We can't use funds from one program to assist in another program. So this is the legislature's way of directing us how we should spend the money that they appropriate to us. This chart shows the scale of our budget between the different programs. 94% of our funds go to the education aid program, which is primarily TIOSA and special education funding, as well as high ability learner and various state-funded school nutrition programs and early childhood programs. So 95% of that money comes into the department, and then we turn around and distribute it out to school districts and other sub-recipients. The administration for our department, for the K-12 side of the program, is about $45 million, or 2.6% of our total budget. Vocational rehabilitation is almost 2% of our budget, and then the rest are very small amounts percentage-wise of our budget. The budget request has 5 required parts. We have to tell them how we're going to spend our money in the current fiscal year that we just started back on July 1. We also have to tell them if we have any building renewal requests. That would involve the School for the Blind and Visually Impaired in Nebraska City. At this point in time, we don't have any requests for that. They just got done with some big work down there the last couple years, and DAS Administrative Services Building Division doesn't have any recommendations for continued work. We also have to submit an information technology plan, which is largely an update from the plan submitted 2 years ago. We don't have any significant new requests around the information technology space as far as running our operations here in the department. The 2 major items are budget issues, which are requests for additional funding by the department or changes in funding, and also budget modifications, which is where we tell the state budget office and the legislature how we would handle a reduction in our state general fund appropriations. The 2 major types of expenditures we have are the flow-through aid, that which we pass through to school districts and other subrecipients, and then our operations, which are personal services, salaries, benefits, contracts, rent, supplies, equipment, those types of things. So our total request for next year is $1.65 billion, 95% of our budget for flow-through aid out to school districts, and $82 million, or 4.8%, for operations internally. So the lion's share of the money we receive and are appropriated by the legislature and the governor flow out to support local education efforts. There are 4 funding sources: general funds, which are state tax receipts; cash funds, which are fees for services, such as teacher certification. Lottery proceeds would also be categorized in that area. Federal funds, grants from the government, IDEA, ESSA, career technical education, and the school lunch program. And then revolving funds, which are a very small piece, and that's an internal charging mechanism within the department. In our budget request for flow-through aid, the 95% of the pie, 80% of that is state general funds, 20% of that is federal funds, and a small sliver, about 1%, is cash funds. Lottery funds make up the majority of that, and then also cash funds for the early childhood endowment for those projects. For our operations, that gets flipped. 62% of our budget is funded by federal grants for operations. 35% comes from state general funds, and then about 3% from cash funds. Again, primarily teacher cert and lottery funded programs. This is a simple breakdown of the operating expenditures by budgetary program, and that's included in the executive summary that was attached to the agenda item. 2 years ago, when Bryce and I came and talked to you about our budget request, we started out 16-17 fiscal year with $25.5 million in state general funds appropriated for our operations, and $1.21 billion for our flow-through activities, TIOSA and special education. Over the intervening 2 years, through legislative appropriations, we've had our operating budget reduced by $650,000. Our current budget request our current budget year has $24.8 million, a significant reduction for us. Flow-through aid has been supplemented to the tune of $18 million over the last 2 years. So there has been investment in that aspect, but we have seen reductions in our operating budget. The last 2 legislative sessions, these are the changes that were made to our flow-through aid. In the 16-17 fiscal year, we had a $1.1 million reduction in aid to school districts and other entities. The last fiscal year, we had a $22.7 million increase, and this year we've had a more modest $5.6 million increase in flow-through aid. Again, our general funds for operations tell a different story. We had some savings that we had reserved for future projects in assessment, early childhood, accountability, and others that were swept by LB 22 in the deficit reduction 2 years ago, and that was to the tune of $4 million. The 16-17 fiscal year, we also had another $1 million of general funds that were reduced from our appropriations. In the 17-18, the last year, we had, again, almost $900,000. And the current year, we have almost $100,000 in reductions in our general funds. So cumulatively, we've lost almost $6 million that we would have the opportunity to spend over the last 2 years. Our requests for additional funding break down into 2 categories, aid and operations. The first category in aid, we're requesting $94.5 million in additional funding for school districts. That's approximately $70 million for TIOSA, $22 million for special education reimbursement, $600,000 to restore cuts to aid programs enacted by LB 944, and some core services and the learning community. Thank you. Requests as well to comply with statute. Our loan request for additional funding for aid, that is new funding, would be $350,000 for the Perkins Revision Program to replace some funding that was reduced 2 years ago. For operations, we're requesting $3.9 million in additional funding. That would fund 10 additional staff members, as well as significant increases in the assessment contracts, $1.7 million for that. The 10 additional people would be 5 to assist Lane Carr and the priority schools and the accountability program, 2 project managers to assist Dr. Folkers in efficiencies across the floor, a reading specialist to support the Reading Intervention Act that was passed last year, a coordinated health specialist, and also a multicultural education specialist. We're also required by the legislature and the governor to request increases in funding for staff salaries and health benefits, and that is the 4% in enterprise requests in the pie chart. That's a requirement that we have to propose to fund staff salary increases and future expenditures related to that. Modifications is an exercise in where we tell the legislature and the governor how we might address reduced funding in state general funds. It's not something that we enjoy doing. It's not something that we feel should be done, but we have to do it so they would understand that. At this point in time, we have not included any specific recommendations for the full board. Those are still under discussion. All of those potential reductions, as well as our request for increases, have to be prioritized so that way the governor's office and the legislature would know an order in which to accept or reject those. One big thing that changed last year, the last budget request, and continues this request, is we have to tell them how we would fund the staff salary increases as well in the case of reduced expenditure appropriations from general funds. The modification level this year is 95% of existing funds. So for our flow-through modifications, that would amount to $61.5 million in reductions to school districts. For our operations, that's a $1.5 million reduction to our general funded operations and is an effective 6.3% reduction. Now the good news is they don't always accept the modifications. Usually it's one or two items that we are compelled to propose, but it does start to cause serious issues for the operational effectiveness of our department and agency. Next steps, we'll come to you with the full budget request and some additional detail for your review. We hope to have that out to you about a week to 10 days prior to the board meeting. But we'll ask you on Friday, September 7, to authorize the commissioner the authority to submit the biennial budget request on behalf of the department and the state board. On October 5th, we'll also bring you potentially some deficit requests for the current year funding. Generally, we always have one related to TIOSA and the insurance premium tax fund and adjusting those appropriation levels, but there may be other things. In January, the governor will present his budget request to the legislature. Generally, late February, early March, the commissioner will testify in front of the Appropriations Committee at a hearing related to our budget. And in May, the budget will be passed and signed by the governor. So with that, I'd open it up to any questions that board members may have.
When you talked about the staff positions,
Yes.
I know a couple of them are new positions, but
Mhm.
are any of those staff positions required by statute?
None of those 10 staff positions that we're requesting funding for would be required by statute, but certainly they would be key in executing statutory duties of the department.
Thank you.
Rachel?
Yeah, I just have a question. If you could work with maybe the Commissioner and Brian in language for the legislative committee to ensure that the requests that we have a cross-reference between this committee and the legislative committee. There are two areas in which the legislative committee is focusing on finance in a certain perspective, and one is certainly around this whole school finance, and the other is around kind of that equitable and value-added alignment of services and supports. And it just seems to me from the discussion today and about the needs that we have, we need to position ourselves in our legislative processes to advocate for those needs as well. So having some language that better articulates what we're proposing in the budgeting process
Okay.
with the legislative committee would be of value.
Thank you, Rachel.
Certainly.
Yes, Molly?
I just wondered if you have had any proactive conversations about the internet sales tax that Nebraska may be receiving. I didn't know if the Nebraska Department of Education was having some internal conversations, possibly how we could best fund public schooling that wouldn't be on the backs of property tax. And maybe, again, it's in the idea of offering a suggestion. For example, the TIOSA formula, if we could use a certain percentage of the internet sales tax to fund TIOSA, that would take some heat off the property owners and taxes. Have you budget guys thought about that much?
There's certainly been conversation,
Yeah, go ahead.
there's certainly conversation going on about that specifically and using that a new, I guess, pot of money, so to speak, as for property tax relief. I think both the governor has made that statement, as well as several senators in that committee that Senator Groney has pulled together. I know that discussion's been a little bit of part of what they're talking about too, so.
Thing is, though, I as a State Board of Education member, I would prefer, instead of just giving it back to property tax relief, wouldn't it be nice to have a sustainable mode of investing in education that would possibly relieve some of these other deficit points in your budget?
Sure,
Yeah.
I think that's an important discussion that we have also, though, because I would take a different point and say we should try to fund special education, increase the reimbursement for our schools, because that's more equitable across the state than TIOSA, because we have so many schools that don't. So I think those are important discussions that we have, that we are on the same page as a board in any recommendations that we might make.
Thank you very much.
And just one last comment on that TIOSA formula. How many non-equalized districts are there now out of 244? Like
170.
170. So I know they're talking about revisiting the whole formula, and it seems to be an appropriate time to make that formula more equitable and more inclusive if we could use some of that money.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, my one thought, and I think it makes some sense that this, and we've been fairly intentional about the asks that are in there, and I think as Shane talked about, the flow-through aid. So we ask for the full intent language out of special education. It's not typical that gets funded. The intent language around aid, the current statutory language around around TIOSA and around what those commitments are. And it's interesting because some might push back on us and say, well, you shouldn't ask for that. These are tough times, right? And the reality is we're asking for what the legislature has said all along should be there. And I think other conversations about what we put into this, like when we're asking for positions in this case, they've asked us to do fairly substantial work. They've asked us to implement an accountability system and to address needs improvement schools, and yet not necessarily are all the resources there to accomplish that. So that's why we include that as one of those particular issues. The Reading Improvement Act and that side of it. At the time that legislation ended up passing, there were conversations with our staff, not even with me, but with our staff, and Senator Linehan and others that supported that and said, well, you really need a staff. You don't have a staff position? No, we don't have a staff position to do that. We've really, and I explained this to the Budget and Finance Committee, there are things that are statutorily required of the department that at one point in time were tied specifically to staff, but as we had vacancies, our approach is over the years, and not just recently, but over the years, we might say, hey, look, we don't have someone in that position. Multicultural being a good example of that. Really a tough time for me to stand on a stage and talk about equity, and I don't have a multicultural position funded. When I have our Native American communities coming to me and saying, we really need to be thoughtful about providing instructional materials and content around, and yet I have no one that's their job. We have people accomplishing the work that's the minimums in statute, but the resources have not necessarily been there for us to accomplish that. And so we lay out a budget. I don't think it's overly aggressive. I don't think we'll get everything funded, but I think there's a point behind each one of these, and if we're supposed to make a difference and provide leadership and accomplish these certain ends, that's what we put into the budget. So I really think, there's a lot of people involved across the agency that puts a budget package together, and a lot of folks that, and I think Bryce's point around, we're so in tune with all of those other revenue sources and conversations because of Bryce and the school finance team paying attention to all of those angles on it. But they don't necessarily ask us where to spend those monies except for when we submit a budget. So what I'm going to tell you is if you think money needs to be spent somewhere in some way, our budgets are time to do that. That's our most powerful ask as a board. And we can do other things in a legislative session where we ask for a bill that would cost money that would be outside of our budget. But those things that we know that we want to ask for, this is the time to ask for them.
Quick, Lisa.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I hope the legislators are paying attention to all of the things that are being said about Nebraska. Just recently in national news about how we approach assessments. Recently in national news about how we're in the top schools in the nation. We can't sustain that without the budgetary needs to reach all kids. And I don't get why I do, but I don't like that we can't get the money we need to do the job that needs to be done.
Any other?
I just,
Rachel,
go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, and then I'll go ahead.
I just kind of want to take off after what the commissioner said. And I think that's one of the reasons that we've tried to make our legislative committee much more proactive, and obviously hasn't been much money in the state budget for anything over the last couple of years, and the approach has been ain't gonna be none for any increases. But I still think it really behooves us to go out and to use this process, the legislative process, and for us as a board to be talking about the things that we perceive as necessary and needed, and to present those present those in a way that, you know, our legislative committee is trying to look forward to doing. So, right on, Commissioner, thank you.
Rachel?
And I'd just like to add, you know, maybe this is Budget Committee could do this. You know, President Witzel, if you'll think about this and bring it back to the Legislative Committee so we can integrate the two. But we've had a lot of discussion about value-added processes and how can we add some value-added processes for efficiency. And I think really adding some of those, we talked about digital content repository and, you know, several different areas that I think are important, that the time is right to have that and lead that conversation about how do we help our schools with some statewide efficiencies.
Any other comments? One quick comment for you, Commissioner. How does this affect our ESSA plan?
Well, I mean, I think generally we always hope to be able to leverage that. And you saw the percentages, kind of the 2/3, 1/3 funding split. We all also will be looking at federal funds and how we leverage those towards our overall approaches and ensure that we're making those things happen. So it's that balancing act, and we do anticipate trying to use ESSA funds, you know, obviously in identifying comprehensive support and improvement schools in a very targeted fashion that helps us build capacity. Even that ELLC conversation that we had earlier is really thinking about how we build capacity across the state for the right leadership. So they are definitely connected. You know, unfortunately, as we kind of watch the state's contribution to those things continue to somewhat diminish in our budget, obviously school districts also have to be in a position where they have the resources necessary. So we're in the middle of a lot of those conversations, and the federal funds as a whole are a pretty small portion of the total, 20% of the flow-through rate, I think, roughly. But when you look at the total, I think it's well under 10 or around 8 or 9%. Is all that the federal side contributes to schools. What'd you say? 6. No, it's down to 6. So there you go.
On behalf of the board, well done, Shane. Well done, Bryce. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Board reports, dates, discussion items. Thank you for submitting your monthly report. Board member reports are linked in the Spark, and I encourage you to review each member report. Tomorrow, we will vote on requests to approve attendance at meetings that took place in the past and were not previously approved. There was one meeting approval request. Requests for future board meeting attendance travel from board members are linked on the Spark meetings. If you have any additional travel requests to be approved, please complete the state board travel request form in your board folder and submit them to Laura and Ryan before tomorrow. Tomorrow, we will approve the board request for meeting attendance. And we are adjourned, and the regularly scheduled meeting of the State Board of Education will convene tomorrow, 9 a.m. in this room. Thank you very much.